You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
Hello and welcome to a special episode of Legendary Africa, a podcast where a disembodied voice speaks, yells, and swears about African myths straight into your ear canal. Today is a special episode because in this episode you'll hear not only one disembodied voice, but two disembodied voices. I am joined today by an amazing podcaster, a folklore enthusiast, and just an all-around brilliant person, the host of the Faerie Folk podcast. Welcome to Legendary Africa.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me on the show. That was a lovely intro. I really appreciate it. I've been a fan of the podcast for a long time, so yeah, I'm really excited to chat to you today.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to have you on. Before we get into our sort of collaborative part of the episode, I was wondering if we could just chat a little bit about the Faerie Folk podcast, tell listeners what's it all about, and why did you start podcasting in the first place?
Yeah, of course. So the Faerie Folk is really designed to be a kind of virtual tour across the UK, but with a little bit of a twist in that all the locations featured on the podcast are connected to local folk tales and myths and legends. So some of them are well known and others not so much. And each of my little episodes kind of decides to speak to people about the different stories from English counties or UK countries. And I'll normally talk a little bit about those locations and their history, and then retell two folktales from the area. As it's also designed to kind of incorporate travel into folklore as well. I sometimes give some travel tips for people who are planning on visiting the area. So yeah, I guess the Faerie Folk is really sort of a mixture of folklore, storytelling, and travel. I also love working with audio and sound design, so I try and create like an immersive experience for my listeners when I'm retelling the stories. And that's actually not something that I get to talk to people about a lot, because it's sort of maybe something that you don't think about a lot when you're listening to podcasts. Is like the sound design is designed to be a natural part of the episode, but it's something that I work really hard on, and I try and make my listeners feel like they're going on a journey. And so it's always quite fun figuring out how I'm going to do a sound effect for like a dragon or a boggart or whatever's in that week's episode. So yeah.
I absolutely love that about your episodes. I actually, I think you kind of inspired me a bit because after I listened to a few of your episodes, I loved the sort of buzzcore feeling you got, and yeah, the use of music and the sound effects. I felt like I was there and you were my guide. So I started incorporating sound effects and music into my episodes. Maybe not as much as you did, but it's really quite amazing. I'm a bit curious. Have you toured a lot yourself around the UK?
Yeah, so thank you so much for that first. That's really sweet. Yeah, so I try and visit as many of the places that I can as possible. Obviously, right now, a lot of us in the UK are under quite strict lockdown restrictions, so that sort of put a halt to a lot of my travel plans. So the Faerie Folk was always designed as a kind of virtual tour anyway, so it's connecting people who might not be able to visit these locations with stories and immersive sound design to make them think as though that they're there, and equally people who have been there to give them a little bit of nostalgia about the places that hopefully they plan on visiting again. So yeah, I always love talking about places that I've been to, and I'll try and mention things that I've really liked and sites that I've seen, and try and recreate the sounds and of being there. But also for me as well, I'm discovering new places and places that I want to visit and like can't wait to visit. Every month I do a podcast episode and I'm like, I can't wait to go here. I really want to go here. I get obsessed with like wherever I'm talking about. So yeah, I've got a long list to catch up on once our restrictions are lifted, for sure.
I think you're really keeping people going during lockdown because, like, as far as they can go is the locust shop.
Yeah, for sure.
What is your interest in folklore? Did you study it, or why did you get interested in the first place?
Oh yeah, that's a great question actually. It's always sort of been a bit of a hobby of mine, but perhaps not something that I like shared with my friends or family. It was just something of I ended up having a collection of all these books about fairies and mythical creatures and folklore. As most people, I went through a Greek mythology phase. I think we've all been there. So I really loved, again, local folklore. So I loved traveling to places and people going, oh, did you know this is where like a mermaid was supposed to have come, or fairies were sighted here? And I was like, wow, that's amazing. And it really connected the stories with the surroundings. And so funnily enough, actually, the Faerie Folk kind of started out as like a holiday plan. And I was like, oh, I'd love to, get in a little camper van and travel across the UK and stop off at all these places and see the sites that I've read about and where folk tales are supposed to take place. But that kind of trip can be expensive and take a lot of time. So I thought, okay, perhaps there's something I can do creatively with this. And so that's kind of where the Faerie Folk was born out of talking about locations and the folklore that comes from them. But hopefully one day I'll be able to do that trip. I think it'd be fab.
That would be amazing. I think you should figure out a way to eventually financially be able to do that. Take pictures and turn your podcast into a book.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. Faerie Folk on the road.
Yeah,
you heard it here first.
You can have a whole map with like pins as to where all the myths. Okay, I'm getting way into this, and I need to just.
That's the dream. That's the dream.
Like I'm planning your book for you.
Oh, thank you.
It's funny that you talk about going through a Greek myth phase because I'm actually a PhD classics student.
Oh yes, of course.
So I'm stuck in the Greek phase.
It's a good phase to have.
All right, well, brilliant. Thanks so much for telling me about all of that. So we decided to talk about water-related lore, or legends, or myths, or folk tales for this episode, which I'm really excited about because I didn't realize that choosing a water theme actually gave you so many possibilities. Like, it's crazy how much lore involves water. I'm not sure if you also found that.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. I think as well, the UK being an island, there's a lot of water around us, so plenty of stories.
So, as my guest, you can of course go first with your water-related lore.
Awesome, thank you so much. So, yeah, as you mentioned before, the UK certainly has its fair share of water-based folklore and creatures. Some like to frequent our shores and beaches, but others prefer more lakes and lochs and rivers. And these creatures can be as kind or as unpredictable as the waters that they live in. So I thought to start us off then, we'd talk about mermaids, probably the most famous aquatic folklore creatures. And these are usually depicted as beautiful women who are human from the waist up, but with scaly fishtails down below. So mermaids pop up in folklore from all over the world, and fairy tales and pop culture works too, that I'm sure yourself and your listeners are quite familiar with. But in the UK, they're mostly spotted, as you would imagine, along UK coastlines. So counties like Cornwall in particular have lots of mermaid tales, pun kind of intended, and they don't just stick to the seas. And mermaids can be spotted in rivers and lakes, and they also have their own stories that are connected to these areas that are away from the sea as well, which is quite interesting. But I think one of the most famous UK mermaid folktales is probably the story of the Mermaid of Zeno, which is one I go on about a lot, usually on social media, because it's my favourite folktale and I love Cornwall, so yeah.
I have never heard of it, so this is new for me.
Oh, perfect. Well, I'll tell you all about it because I never get bored of telling this tale because I think it's really sweet. And it's all about a mermaid who visits a church in Zennor in Cornwall after hearing the beautiful singing that's coming from inside the church. So she starts to visit the church regularly and join in with the choir, and she soon falls for a handsome young man who's the best singer in all the village, called Matthew Torella. And soon the two then disappear, which might seem like a tragic mystery to the uninitiated, but the locals always knew the truth that the mermaid had actually taken Matthew home to live with her under the sea over at Pendle Cove. So yeah, that's the story of the Mermaid of Zeno, which again I really enjoy because it's actually got a happy ending, which is kind of rare sometimes for folk tales. So I think it's quite sweet.
I have questions, if you don't mind, for this tale.
Of course, I'll try.
First, I love horror movies, anything that's scary. So when you said they disappeared, literally my first thing was, okay, so she's killed him. She's taken him somewhere and killed him, because that's obviously my first thought. And secondly, did she give him some sort of a water helmet?
Well, yeah, this is it. I think that's so funny how you say that, because it's the kind of classic two kinds of people, because I was like, oh, she's like got a little mermaid boyfriend and they're so happy.
I'm so sorry. I'm a realist. That's terrible.
No, it's fair. I think, yeah, a lot of folk tales do unfortunately end up dragging, especially with mermaids as well, like dragging sailors underneath the waves. But this tale in particular is, I suppose they believe that Matthew was kind of taken away to live under the sea with the mermaid that fell for him. And actually, the story has a second part where a sailor comes across the mermaid and goes, you've put an anchor in front of my home. I can't reach my children and my husband." And the sailor gets sort of a look at the mermaid and recognizes her as the woman that used to sing in the church, and so kind of puts two and two together.
That's so sweet. Brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk a little bit about the kind of explanations behind the story. It's something I like to do on my podcast as well, is explore where these folktales might have come from. I always like to put the question out there that, yeah, of course, it was a real mermaid, potentially, or it could also have been an influence. So in Zennor, the church that the mermaid visited is called St. Senara's, and that is supposed to be the church that the mermaid visited in the story. So that church, actually, that you can visit has a carving of the mermaid on one of its wooden pews. So people have come to speculate whether the mermaid from the folktale is the one that's depicted on the chair, or whether the chair actually inspired the legend itself. So there's a little bit of kind of mystery around it, which is nice. And the mermaid in the carving as well is also holding a mirror and a comb, which is something that I've done a little bit of research into recently, and found that kind of symbolism of like a mirror and a comb during the Middle Ages, that were the signs of pride and vanity. So I think when a mermaid was depicted holding those items, it was sort of warning churchgoers not to indulge in the sins of vanity. And so I think that might be why the carving was created, potentially. But of course, it could have been because a mermaid once visited that church. So yeah.
That's so cool. Was there any sort of evidence that there was like a woman with a particularly beautiful voice that sung there, or anything like that?
Not that I've found, unfortunately, but there are sort of talk about as well the Matthew Trello of the story, because it's quite interesting that he's named, because a lot of these folk tales are like a young man from Cornwall. So it's interesting that he has that name. So perhaps he's come from a local man that did once exist in Cornwall. And also there's talk about, because Zennor again is on like a cliff facing the sea, there is potential for, in a big storm, people to go missing and disappear in the storm. So I think perhaps that could be where this tale has come from as well. But again, these are just my own speculations, so who knows?
Another realist question that came to mind is, how did she swim up to the church?
You know what? That's a great
I'm
question.
so sorry. I should just stop it.
No, it's actually quite funny, because a recent podcast episode I did was about a mermaid over in Norfolk, and she managed to, I think she went about 1.5 miles or something like that from the beach to this church, and there's no recording of how she did it. It's sort of saying like, did she like, I don't know, I sort of, in my story I pictured as if she was sort of dragging her tail all the way to the church, but apparently she might have got some help somewhere. But yeah,
Or maybe her fins just sort of transform into legs conveniently.
yeah, I think, I'm going to say that the mermaid in this story, she magically transformed her tail into legs, and that's how she got there.
So you know what's really strange but also funny is that I also decided to talk about mermaids.
Hey, perfect. Well, I think it sort of goes with the water folklore theme. Like, I'd be surprised if there weren't mermaids there.
So yeah, I wanted to talk about mermaids of Africa, and I discovered that the myth or in the lore of people has actually existed in Africa for centuries, and has actually been found in several areas over the continent. So first we have like the indigenous people from West Africa, the Efik, Igbo, Anang, etc. They believed, and some still believe, in the water deity Mami Wata. And maybe you've heard of Mami Wata.
I haven't, I'm afraid. I'd love to know more, though.
She's actually a water goddess of fertility and prosperity, but she's depicted as this woman who is generally naked on the top, and then she has 1 or 2 fishtails, so that's why we're calling her mermaid. So she can also apparently be sometimes male, but usually female, and she is a huge figure. So if I really wanted to talk about her, that would be a whole episode by myself.
Yes.
There's actually so much about her. There's also mermaids apparently in Mali, the Dogon people, an ethnic group indigenous to the central plateau of Mali. They worship the creator god Amma, who actually made these half fish, half human creatures called Nomos, who are apparently ancestral spirits. So they were also depicted as mermaids. But the story that I am actually really interested in is a story that originates from the Karoo in South Africa. There's a town called De Rust, which I don't know if you know where the crane and the Groot Karoo is, but it really does not matter too much.
Okay.
There's a mountain pass and rock pools, and apparently some people have spotted, and I'm talking about like modern spottings, of a dark-haired mermaid, of a very beautiful woman, and she's a mermaid. What's interesting, because from your story, you were talking about how the mermaids are often depicted combing their hair and with a mirror.
Yes.
Yeah, it's kind of the same thing. They said that she looks like she's sitting on rocks and she's combing her long dark hair and looking into the rock pool. So the rock pool is kind of like the mirror while she combs her hair.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, so I find it kind of interesting that there's that connection. I'm not sure whether the mermaid stories from the UK have influenced us or whether it's just a coincidence.
Yeah, definitely. It's quite nice to find crossovers, I think, between folk tales, and they're interesting on are they based on the same thing of people interpreting things in their own way, or is it because people have traveled and brought the stories with them, or is it
Mm.
indeed the mermaids have gotten around and everyone spotted them at some point?
Yeah, exactly. This one is supposed to be sort of malevolent, so she actually waits for people to pass
Mhm.
by and then she lures them to the edge and drags them to the depths. But
Lovely.
yeah, love it. It's interesting. There's been some rock paintings by the ancient Khoisan people of southern Africa, and supposedly these paintings depict mermaids. And the Khoisan people were apparently trying to say that these mermaids are responsible for the floods and the rain and the drought, and that you have to be careful with them and to respect them, otherwise your crops are going to be in trouble. Kind of like a worshipping idea behind that, which I thought was quite interesting.
Oh yeah, definitely.
There were a few theories, going off what you were talking about in terms of where did these mermaids come from. There's a really interesting one which I want to call the reverse Atlantis theory, which 250 million years ago, this same area that I'm talking about where the mermaid was spotted was actually submerged underwater. But it's now like a semi-desert area. But back then it was a complete water wonderland. So the theory is that the oceans withdrew and it left the rocky valley behind. But some people believe that these mermaids that were living there have basically just adapted to living in the desert area. So they're just fish people from 250 million years ago.
Oh wow, that's awesome. I like the idea of like mermaid evolution, I guess, of them adapting to living on land.
Some other people think that it's more created or changed a little bit to reflect, about the importance of water and the fact that we're not appreciating it enough, and that's why we have global warming and all these other sort of issues. So that ties in quite well, I think, with the figure of Mummy Water, because she's a goddess of fertility. So it's sort of like cyclical, trying to bring it
Mhm.
back how important water is. But there's just one more thing that I wanted to tell you about one particular sighting by this woman, Antoinette. She actually claims that she knows someone who encountered a mermaid. It was this girl who apparently spotted a mermaid, and you're not supposed to stare at a mermaid, but this girl, I don't know whether she was entranced or she was so enchanted that she looked straight at the mermaid, and the mermaid splashed her face with water. And apparently, if you look at this woman now, her face shines like a rainbow pearls.
Wow.
Strong evidence for something very interesting that happened.
Yeah, that's a really interesting story actually. I haven't heard the kind of folklore of mermaids not being able to be looked at, I guess, but it reminds me kind of a bit of uh nymphs in Greek mythology, I suppose.
Mm.
Um and also I guess maybe the kind of spying on creatures and folklore creatures like fairies. They don't like to be spied on by humans, so maybe it's a little bit of that of mind your own business, which I think is probably the story of a lot of fairy tales and humans wandering into places they shouldn't.
Yeah, like with Artemis.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, there definitely seems to be some sort of reverence for the mermaids here. There was another story where this farmer apparently saw a mermaid and was so shocked that he shot at her. And then 3 days later, they've never seen floods of this magnitude, and literally just hit and destroyed the whole area. Everyone put it down to the fact that he had tried to attack this mermaid.
Yeah, there's definitely a similar tale actually from Cornwall as well, which tells of a mermaid down in Padstow who was shot by a man who was hoping to make her his wife, but she was not having it. And as revenge, she caused this thing called a doom bar, which you can find in Padstow, which is like a big area of sand, basically, which has affected ships. So it sometimes like ships would crash into it because you can't see it, like the sand under the waves. So the mermaid is supposed to be responsible for the creation of that because of what the man did. So yeah, there's definitely a link there between mermaids and their revenge, I think.
Yeah, I suppose because they're special creatures and there's something rather barbaric about humans. So,
Maybe so.
but it's so weird that we both did mermaids because I mean we didn't plan that. Those were listening, and there's quite a
No.
few similarities between them.
Yeah, definitely.
I don't know whether you can tell me how old the lore of mermaids.
Yeah, I mean, so the mermaid carving that I mentioned before, I think that's meant to have been dated to around the 15th century. So I think I'd imagine that's when those tales started to become more prevalent. But when they originated, I'm afraid I can't say. But yeah, they feel like they've been an integral part of folklore for a long time here.
And then, I mean, if the Khoisan were painting them, then that is years and years ago. So it'd be interesting to somehow find out whether there was some sort of interaction. I mean, I thought there must be because, I mean, obviously there was interaction. So why wouldn't folk tales also get swapped?
Yeah, I think that'll be a really interesting study to do to kind of compare these stories and try and find where the similarities are and how the cultures have influenced one another.
So now I must ask you, have you ever had any sort of mythical or strange encounter that you might have thought was a bit magical? Did you ever experience anything like that?
Oh, that is another great question. I think it's very hard to say because I think there are times when you brush things off and think, oh, that was just my imagination or just a coincidence or something like that. But I have to say I've had a few maybe ghostly encounters in London usually, which is actually quite a haunted city, which I've talked about before on my podcast. But I'd probably end up visiting again because there are so many ghosts. Where I was like, when I was quite young, I was on a train with my family. And I looked out the window and I saw a woman staring right into the carriage, like right up close to the carriage staring in. And I was like, oh, and I sort of turned to my family as if to be like, can you see this woman like staring in? And of course, when I turned back, she was gone. So yeah, none of them saw her either. So that was one of those moments where I was like, I think I may have just seen a ghost. But it could have just been a very nosy passenger. I don't know. But yeah, that's my one strange encounter. But maybe there'll be a few more to come. I don't know.
That's terrifying. I mean, I love ghost stories, and I don't know whether like I wholeheartedly believe them, and I don't know whether I have actually had a proper experience. I mean, there was one time when I woke up in the middle of the night because at least I thought that my cupboards were shaking and banging,
Ooh.
and there should have been no reason for that to have happened. But then, sort of when I woke up
Yeah.
properly, there was nothing there, so I was like, was it just dreaming? Oh, was there a poltergeist in my room?
Oh, yeah, that's pretty spooky. Yeah, it's hard to tell, but that's what I quite like about ghost stories is that question of you sort of don't know. And as I mentioned before with like London and I guess with my podcast as well, I love ghost stories that are connected to history and connected to the locations that they are. So I love like haunted theatres are brilliant because you get stories of like the actors that were once on the stage that still, watch performers to this day. And I love stories like that because I think they make you feel like, oh yeah, well, yeah, that actor did act there, or that queen did frequent that castle. So why would she not be spotted there? So I quite like those ghost stories that have like connections to history in that way.
Yeah, those are very interesting. I think I looked at a apparently haunted hospital in South Africa where
Yes, I remember that episode.
oh you thank you. It was abandoned, and I love a good abandoned hospital, sure. Which sounds creepy, but I mean,
Yeah.
Doors creaking and the windows are broken, so the wind sort of whistled through the building. Like, I want to go there, but also I probably shouldn't. 'Cause...
Yeah, that's probably me with most places. It's like fear and excitement.
I wanted to also ask if you could pick a folklore or myth to sort of be in.
Oh, yeah. I guess probably one of my favorite folklore creatures or legendary creatures is probably the Loch Ness Monster. It's a very famous creature, of course, but I love the story, and it was one of the things that got me into folklore when I was younger as well. So I loved hearing stories from Scotland about this creature, and it's like, yeah, it's fantastic, and I love the history of all the people that went and tried to find the monster and to prove that it existed in very sort of classic British 30s style of on the news reporting about, yes, I've sighted the creature, and I love it. It's so dramatic, and it's very human as well, ironically, because the story ends up being about the kind of people that created hoaxes and people that tried to prove it, and scientists and everything like that. So I think that's really interesting about like the human psyche, on how people felt like they saw things, or maybe they were only seeing things because other people claimed to have seen things, or how things can get misinterpreted. So I love all of that. And there's a man named Steve Feltham that literally, he lives on the side of Loch Ness, just watching and waiting for a sighting of the creature. And he's been there for, I think, about 30 years. And that's my dream life. Like, that's all I want from life, just to park up next to his house, his caravan, and be like, hey, I'm here with my cup of tea, just waiting for a sighting. Like, that's a dream.
So it's amazing how these kind of some of these stories can really just carry on being so popular, and it just sticks with you. I mean, the Loch Ness Monster, I think what's Bigfoot is another one that people can't shake. For some reason they're obsessed with trying to find it.
Yeah.
It's really amazing how myths can actually sort of make you learn about yourself in a way. I think that's what, as you're saying, that's what the Loch Ness monster was showing us, because we really put our all into trying to find something that we don't even know is actually there.
Yeah, I think I like that about folklore in general, because something like the Loch Ness Monster, it's an ongoing mystery. There's people that still believe in it to this day, and there's always new sightings. Actually, there was a sighting like I think 4 weeks ago on like a webcam over the loch. Like, I'm always like googling like to try and see like, oh, has anyone spotted Nessie recently? Like, is she okay in lockdown? Like, just checking in on my girl. So yeah, I love that it's sort of like a living, thriving legend, because a lot of the things that I read about are from years and years ago and centuries ago. So it's great to have something that's ongoing and still feels like a mystery. I love that.
Well, it's been so amazing to have you as a collab guest on the show. I had a great time, and I apologize for the impromptu questions. I just got really into the stories you were talking about.
That's okay. Thank you so much. I love talking about this sort of thing and getting a chance to share some of my favorite stories. And I'm always happy to talk about mermaids for as long as possible.
No, seriously, I've had a great time. I hope we can actually collab again in the future about, well, anything really, because I feel like we both have such a reserve to draw from, the fire element or something.
Yeah, let's go through the elements. That'd be great.
So thank you so much again for coming on the show. I'd like to let our listeners where they can find your podcast, how to follow you, and that sort of stuff.
Awesome. Yeah. So you can find the Faerie Folk on the usual kind of podcast apps. But also, if you're looking for some social media stuff, I'm also on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under @thefaerie_folk. And I always remind my listeners that it's fairy spelt FAERIE rather than like IRY, because it's, a little change like that can be a bit pedantic on the internet. But anyway, so that's how you can find me there. And I try and sort of share photos of some of the places that I've traveled to. And also try and share listeners' photos if they've been to some of the places that I've mentioned. So if you've heard about a place that you're interested in, you can have a little look, and maybe there'll be a photo of it there so you can see what it's like. I also have a YouTube channel, but it's a little bit neglected at the moment, but I'm hoping to create some new content for it soon, hopefully when I can get out and about traveling again. So yeah, you can keep a lookout for there as well.
I actually wanted to ask you why you chose to spell fairy that way, considering this. I mean, there's quite a few options. Is there a particular reason you chose FAERIE?
Yeah, actually, so I've read quite a few stories and legends about fairies and fairy tales and fairy folk, which is a whole episode I can talk about. But so I've seen the word fairy spelt like that because it sometimes encompasses fairy as like the other world. So fairy standing for like the world of the fairies rather than just like the creatures themselves. So because on my podcast I like to talk about lots of different folk tales, myths, legends, ghosts, all of it, I felt like fairy was quite a good encompassing name to just mean like the folk of the other world. So yeah, that's kind of the backstory to my little name.
Oh, that's brilliant. I'm so glad you explained it because I didn't actually realize what the difference means. So when I saw the fairy folk, I immediately was okay. So you're talking about fairies, but now I completely understand what you're talking about. That's
Yeah, maybe it's a little bit too subtle, but yeah.
no, we must just educate ourselves.
Oh no.
But thank you so much again, and please do come back to the show sometime.
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you so much for having me on. I really, really appreciate it. It's been great.
And now it is time to love and leave you, my wonderful listeners. Be sure to follow the podcast on Twitter and Instagram at LegendaryPod1 and at LegendaryPod. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, check out our website, and check out the wonderful Straight Up Strange network by following the link in the show notes. Please go follow my guest, the Faerie Folk, on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Check out her podcast wherever it's available, and also her YouTube channel. You can contact me either by sliding into my DMs or by emailing me at staylegendarypod@gmail.com. If you want to collab, be a guest, swap promos, or simply to have a chat and a cup of something delicious virtually together. Until next month, mask up, sanitize before you fraternize, and of course, stay safe, stay sexy, and stay legendary. Bye!